How should I know when to change my settings or my setup? Now, this is a question I've seen many times, many times, and it is familiar to all of us who play competitive FPS. We've all experienced the sudden urge to change things in our settings or our setup. So in this podcast, I want to go over two major areas of this. And the first area is understanding why we might have those urges in the first place and whether they're motivated in a good way or a bad way. And then secondly, I want to go over diagnosing our problems. Now that we know that we need to change something, how do we diagnose ourselves? And what are some good practices and some bad practices and so on and so forth? And I think this is a really cool topic, and given that I'll be doing a lot more solo episodes like this, I felt like this would be a great place for me to start the podcast up again by answering this question or discussing this question. So firstly, why do we want to change things? What's going on there? So typically we first experience this when we are frustrated with our performance. Usually our performance is the metric that we have that makes us either happy with our experience playing the game or unhappy with our experience playing the game. And when we're new players or even experienced players in a lot of cases, we don't necessarily have good metrics to understand what a good performance is or a bad performance is. Because I think we can all agree that ultimately, we all want good performances, and ultimately good performances make us feel good. So for example, if we lose a game but we perform very well, we actually feel pretty good about ourselves, unless of course there was something huge riding on that game, like you're trying to qualify for a minor, for example, which seems topical because I'm at the minors right now. Equally, if we perform badly, even though we win a game, we don't feel good. Like emotionally, we don't feel good about ourselves, typically. And again, that can vary depending on the scenario, but generally speaking, I think this is true for most people. We all want to perform well. Performing well makes us feel good, but our ability to understand whether we perform well or not, that can be something that by default might not necessarily tell the whole picture. For example, if we look at poker very quickly and the idea of outcome-orientedness, you could express the correct decision-making, which is using poker terminology, plus EV or plus expected value. You can make these great decisions repeatedly, but you could not be rewarded for those great decisions. Generally, esports titles are pretty similar to this concept insofar as you're trying to make decisions with incomplete information. So you have to make your best guess. And so you're effectively operating via percentages in that way. And so even if we have a 90%, which I think all of us can agree, a 90% success rate is a pretty good spot to be in. However, 10% of the time, we're going to lose that situation. And sometimes you might have a bad string of outcomes, even though you have a good string of decisions. So that's a really interesting concept, right? Because when we're thinking about our performance, if we don't understand whether our decisions are correct, then we're just looking at what is inherently inconsistent, which is our executional performance. So our ability to hit shots, our mechanical skill. And that can fluctuate wildly. And this is the funny thing, I think, to me, is that we tend to look at our performance, when it comes to aiming and so on and so forth, as that kind of is much more gratifying and makes us feel good. But it's ultimately inherently inconsistent. The thing that's the most consistent is actually the decisions that you make. And if you go through a passage of play and you die and it doesn't go well, you get that bad outcome, well, did you actually make the right decisions? Because if you can say so, hey, you know what? I'd actually make the same choice every single time. I really feel like, based on my study of the game, my understanding of the game, that this decision made the most sense. If you can say that, then all of a sudden you can just accept the scenario, and it kind of negates any bad emotions from that situation, typically in most scenarios. So this is where, again, our bad emotions tend to come from. And this is what will generally frustrate people and make you start to think, maybe I should change my settings. Maybe something's wrong here. So yes, while it is the case that maybe you don't understand how to look at a fight, to understand even where the percentages should be going, how do the angles work? Do I understand that? Do I understand right angle, a right eye peak? Do I understand geometric advantage? Do I understand off angles? Do I understand how to jiggle? Do I understand all these mechanics that surround making a fight advantageous? Do I have good team play? Do I have good utility usage? Am I communicating to my teammates and so on? There's so many aspects that can tip things in your favor. But absolutely, it is the case that, hey, you know what? Still, there is a distinct possibility that there could be something wrong with your settings or your setup. So how do we actually figure that out? Now that we've kind of looked at the fact that, hey, sometimes it is actually just decision making, but how do we understand now that, all right, I've got something that I should probably change? So now we're getting into the territory of diagnosing ourselves, like the self-diagnosis of your own mechanics. And that, I mean, what does that even mean? How do you even begin to look at that? I think that for me, the way that I like to put this is I think that the game tells you what it needs from you. Well, if you're someone that's watched a lot of professional Counter-Strike and you have experience also contrasting that of yourself playing personally, you will start to notice some patterns and some trends of very specific things that the game requires of you when it comes to understanding how to have good mechanics. And good mechanics are going to be ranging from having good tracking, and that is being able to consistently track your opponent no matter the distance, because the distance changes the speed that they'll be moving. So if they're very far away, they'll be moving very slowly. So if you have a very fast sensitivity, you have to have a mouse control with that sensitivity that allows you to track them precisely and consistently. That's the key. Consistency is very important with tracking. And also similarly, when they're very close, you have to be able to move and track very quickly. And this also transfers to crosshair placement, and crosshair placement is a way to train your tracking aim. These are very important parts of the mechanics. We also understand that first bullet precision is a really big deal. Flick shots, micro flicks, very small adjustments, and then larger flicks as well. We understand that we need to be able to switch targets within very accurately and very quickly between a 90-degree field left and also the right of our center view. And also we need to be able to reset our mouse and be able to do a 180 immediately, because then that unlocks, if you can do a 180 then reset your mouse aim into it, so you'll reset into the center view. You then have the ability to very quickly, once again, comfortably hit targets that are 90 degrees to the left or to the right of your center view. So these are some of the things that the game is telling you, hey, you got to be able to do these things. And so we need to understand what kind of mouse technique we're using. What is something that is natural for you? And there are 3 grips, and there's 3 different ways to use, and there's multiple ways to use these grips and ways to hybridize them. So for example, it's kind of accepted commonly that the 3 grips are the palm grip, the claw grip, and the fingertip grip. And depending on your grip, you're going to have a different range of sensitivity that makes sense for you to be comfortably operating with that grip. So for example, the palm grip, which I would say is the most common in Counter-Strike and in FPS games these days, now that we have a lot more space and bigger mouse pads and all the rest of it, is going to allow you to recruit the arm maximally. And the wrist recruitment is minimal if non-existent. And that means that you can have extremely slow sensitivities, but because you have all this space to work with, because you have such a big range of motion with your arm, quite a lot is possible. And it's a pretty consistent grip, and again, it's used very widely for a reason. Now, if you're using this grip, remember, you can operate with very slow sensitivities. If you want to go for a more mid-range sensitivity, we're talking more the claw grip. The claw grip is a grip which is really good to kind of as a hybrid grip if you want it to be so, because you can kind of recruit the arm and the wrist depending on your sensitivity. Now, the more wrist recruitment that you have in your movements, that you want to have in your movements, that feels natural for you, the faster your sensitivity needs to be. Because, and we're talking, part of the consideration here is we're talking wrist health. If you're using a very slow sensitivity and you're trying to recruit your wrist, you're going to have huge issues in the ability to execute some of the things I mentioned previously, such as being able to turn 90 degrees left of center view or right of center view is going to be a huge problem. And there's some other reasons for this as well. For example, when the wrist is going, I always mix these up, inwards. So if you're right-handed and you're kind of moving your wrist to the left, that is going to be radial deviation, and the outside is ulnar deviation. And so there is a mobility component here. There will be discrepancy person to person. Some people have a bit more mobility, a bit more flexibility on one side or the other. So there's already an inherent discrepancy between your ability to move to the left and to the right based on your wrist mobility. So you have to have a pretty fast sensitivity to not only achieve, again, what the game needs you to do comfortably, but also talking from a health perspective, anatomically, you also have to have a sensitivity that makes sense. And there is a degree of being able to generate the sensitivity and the coordination and the motor memory to have a level of mouse control which will allow you to control very fast sensitivities or very slow sensitivities. This is technique work, let's not forget. And with technique, when we're practicing, we're teaching our brain how to fire off the correct, signals and all the rest of it to correctly and effectively do what we want the body to do. And it requires practice, but it also requires you to be smart. So as I mentioned, with the claw grip, you get to kind of, if you're going for a slightly faster sensitivity, still in the mid-range, you can recruit more wrist. But if you're going a bit slower, then you want to recruit less wrist and more arm, and that's totally fine. But it's, again, a little bit more advanced in terms of what it allows you to do. There's more tools there. For example, sometimes I talk on my stream how I actually switch grips between almost a fingertip grip and a claw grip, insofar as I'll plant my wrist on the mouse pad, and it will everything will pivot off of my wrist, so there's no arm involvement when I'm doing sort of flick motions. But when I'm doing tracking, I actually take the wrist off of the mouse pad and I start using way more arm. I start recruiting my arm massively because I find more consistency on tracking movements. And so obviously if you're doing something like that, that's pretty advanced because I'm switching techniques, but this is something that's possible. And lastly, we have the fingertip grip, which is going to be recruiting typically the wrist maximally. And if you're doing this, again, you need to be somebody that is having a very fast sensitivity typically. And again, we don't have to be scared of fast sensitivities. Yes, they feel very hard to control, but there are huge examples of many different types of players in the past and in the present that can control these sensitivities. And so if it feels like something that's natural to you, then you should definitely give it a try and use it and try to learn it. Now, Woxic, for example, is the most extreme example I can think of. He has a sensitivity for Counter-Strike that is unbelievable. It's something in the region of 10 centimeters for a 360. That is a very fast sensitivity. I have a very fast sensitivity in terms of Counter-Strike, and it's like on the fast end in terms of Quake, and he has double. His is double, like more than 2 times faster than mine, which is insane. And anyway, I digress. So ultimately, so long as what you're doing makes sense based on your anatomical requirements for good health, as well as understanding your anatomical limitations, and then also we talk about what the game needs you to be able to do, and you need to be able to do those things comfortably. Now we have kind of a basis of understanding of what ranges of sensitivities we're working with when it comes to the grips that we're working with. So if, for example, you're really struggling to perform one of these things that, again, the game needs you to be able to do, like, for example, be able to flick to people comfortably, or track people comfortably, or maintain your lateral movement very consistently, which is required to maintain your crosshair at head height at all times if necessary. Or if, for example, you're struggling with the mouse lift and the reset because your sensitivity is so slow, you just can't quite nail that swiping motion, that mouse lift motion for the 180 and reset. Like, if you're struggling with these things, practice them. And then if through your practice, if you're finding out that certain things are particularly difficult and you just aren't receiving the right progression, even when you're focusing on practicing that specific element and you're hitting a wall there, that might be an indication that you're having problems. To me, it's very obvious to be able to diagnose people and see what problems they have. And I can kind of guess probably what grip they're using and what their sensitivities are by seeing them and looking at how they respond in situations. Like, if they have particularly clunky movement, then it's, they're struggling to, if they turn to the left and then they're struggling to get that extra bit of range to deal with an opponent, and they're suddenly their crosshair placement and their sensitivity becomes a bit of a mess, then to me it's very obvious that they have a sensitivity that's too slow for their grip, because that typically happens to players that are wrist aimers that have a too low of a sensitivity. There is a lot of tells if you know what you're looking for. So given all of that information, we can self-diagnose. Now let's go through some of the practices that would be good practices in terms of actually knowing how to go about making the changes. So again, I have to emphasize, we need to work within comfort, and we need to work within what makes sense in terms of, okay, I have something right now that's not comfortable. what do I think would be more comfortable? So it might be the case that you feel like everything's a little bit slow and there's too much effort required in some of the movements. So you've decided that you want to change your sensitivity, or maybe even you've decided that you want to change your grip. Now, what I would recommend doing is picking something that is, I mean, it can be a big change if you want it to be. It doesn't matter too much. Again, as long as it sticks to the rules within how the grips work, as I've described, then you're fine. But what I would say is, if you're taking a break and you're coming back, that's the best time to change stuff, is when you're coming back. Or what would also be good is even forcing a break and then coming back with the changes. I really think that this is a very good practice because of a few different reasons. Firstly, because we always, I would say, tend to overtrain or overplay. And what happens when we take a break is we are able to refresh ourselves emotionally with the game. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? It's one of those types of things. You know, we love playing the game, but if you're experiencing a lot of bad results, if you're in that position where you don't have the most emotional connection to the game because you're in, or you're in a position where you want to change something, taking a break of even a few days, I would say usually minimally a week is really good. But if you can't go a week, at least 4 or 5 days would be really useful. And that kind of makes you a little bit rusty. It kind of resets you emotionally with the game. You look forward to playing. And then what I would say is, don't even necessarily jump into matches. What I would say is, go onto the death match, go onto the aim training, practice things very specifically, isolate all the various different things that you need to be able to do with that, with the aim. Get to know this new technique, get to know this new sensitivity inside and out, and start to build an understanding of it. Because the thing is, when you start actually playing the game, your focus is not just on that, it's on your decision making as well. So you're not going to be as effectively able to train all these new things you've just implemented. And so for me, this is the best practice. This is the best way to do it. Have a clean break. You're gonna feel better about the game. You're going to be able to attack your new settings more effectively, and life is going to be good. Right, so I feel like that covers things fairly well. What I haven't discussed is some of the other small things that people might change. We talked about settings and setup. So I would say settings and setup, sensitivity and the grips definitely kind of come under that. But stuff like changing resolution, changing your crosshairs, and all these other things that you can alter, which will give you a different feel in the game. I think these things are fairly superficial. They don't take too long to get used to. I think ultimately what you need to do there is find something that's comfortable. Again, one rule of thumb here for me is that if it's something like resolution, that does actually impact the way that your sensitivity and everything else is going to feel, and the way that your brain is going to interpret everything coming at you on the screen. So this is something whereby if you do it, I would say really stick with it for at least a month, guys. Just that should be a minimum. When it comes to stuff like crosshair, that doesn't really impact anything almost. It's just like a slight kind of an emotional kind of difference that, it feels a bit different. It maybe makes you focus a little bit more on the center of the screen because the crosshair, you notice that change after, something else, you were used to something else for so long. So that's something that, you can do that, change that as much as you want. It doesn't really matter too much. So long as you're not obsessing over it, it doesn't really matter if you change it every few days. But I think that about covers it in terms of settings and setup. I hope that this was informative, and if you have any questions about any of this, please hit me up on Twitter or send me an email, whatever it is. And if you'd like me to cover any other topics pertaining to performance in Counter-Strike or in competitive FPS at all, any game, then well, that's PC related. I suppose I can't speak too much to console stuff, but that's PC related. Let me know, and I'd love to make podcasts answering your questions if they are meaty enough. All right, thanks guys.